The classroom went silent in a way that did not feel normal, because it was the kind of silence that made your ears ring and your chest tight. And in the middle of that silence stood Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore with her hands still locked around the neck of 12-year-old Amara Johnson, whose small body had just gone completely still in front of 20 frozen students who did not understand how something so terrible could happen so quickly. The fluorescent lights above flickered softly as if they were struggling to stay on, and a chair lay tipped over on the floor where Amara had tried to push herself away, her fingers now limp and unmoving as her head tilted at an unnatural angle, while Mrs. Whitmore's face, once calm and strict like every other school day, now looked drained of all color as her eyes widened slowly like someone waking from a nightmare she could not escape. No one screamed at first because shock wrapped itself around every child in that room like a heavy blanket, making it hard to breathe or even think, until one boy at the back let out a broken sob that shattered the silence into 1,000 pieces, and suddenly whispers, gasps, and trembling voices filled the air as reality began to sink in. Just before we get back to it, I'm curious to know, where are you watching from today? And if these stories have been keeping you captivated, be sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. But before anyone could run, before anyone could call for help, before Mrs. Whitmore could even step away from what she had done, the classroom door creaked open with a slow and steady sound that seemed louder than anything else in the world at that moment. Every head turned. Standing at the doorway was a woman in full United States Army uniform, her boots firm against the ground and her posture straight as steel, her presence commanding and unshakable, yet her eyes softened for just a second as they searched the room, clearly expecting to see her daughter sitting safely at her desk. That second did not last long, because her gaze landed on Amara, and then everything changed. The mother did not scream immediately. She did not rush forward like one might expect. Instead, she froze in place as if her entire body had turned to stone, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were seeing, while Mrs. Whitmore slowly released her grip and stepped back, her hands trembling as though they no longer belonged to her. The air felt heavier with each passing second, and the students watched in complete terror as the soldier's face shifted from confusion to disbelief, and then into something far more dangerous, something that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken emotions, pain, rage, and a quiet storm that had not yet been unleashed. Mrs. Whitmore opened her mouth as if she wanted to explain, but no words came out, only a shaky breath that made it clear she had no idea how to face what stood before her. And just as the mother finally took her first step into the classroom, her boots echoing against the floor like the ticking of a clock counting down to something irreversible, the school bell rang loudly through the halls, cutting through the moment like a sharp blade and making everything feel even more unreal. But what happened next would not only shock that classroom, it would uncover a story no one saw coming, and the truth behind that moment would shake the entire town. Long before that terrible moment inside the classroom, Amara Johnson was known as the kind of girl who carried quiet strength in her smile, the type of child who did not speak too loudly but always listened carefully. And even when others overlooked her, she still managed to shine in her own calm and steady way that made her teachers praise her work and her classmates slowly grow to respect her. She had moved to the town just a year earlier, following her mother, Sergeant Alicia Johnson, whose duty in the United States Army meant she could not always stay in one place for long. And though the constant moving made life difficult, Amara had learned to adapt quickly, building small pieces of home wherever she went and holding tightly to the one thing that never changed, which was her mother's love and discipline. Sergeant Johnson was not just a soldier in uniform. She was a woman who had seen things most people could not imagine, and yet when she came home, she softened her voice, helped with homework, and reminded her daughter every single night that no matter how hard the world became, she had to stand tall and never let anyone break her spirit. At first, the school seemed like a safe place, with bright hallways and friendly faces, and when Amara was introduced to her new class, Mrs. Alina Whitmore stood at the front with a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes, welcoming her in a voice that sounded warm on the surface, but carried a tone that some students had already learned to be cautious of. Mrs. Whitmore had been teaching for over 20 years, and many parents trusted her because of her experience. Yet among the students there were quiet whispers that she was stricter than most, that she picked favorites, and that sometimes her patience could disappear without warning, leaving behind a sharp edge that made even the bravest children lower their heads. For the first few weeks, Amara tried her best to fit in, raising her hand when she knew the answer, completing her assignments neatly, and keeping to herself when others laughed or formed groups that did not include her. But slowly, small things began to change in ways that were easy to miss unless you were paying close attention. It started with simple corrections that felt harsher than necessary, where Mrs. Whitmore would single Amara out for mistakes that others made without consequence, her voice growing firmer, her gaze lingering longer than it should, and though Amara said nothing at home, her shoulders began to carry a weight that had not been there before. Then came the day when a classmate whispered something cruel under his breath, and when Amara turned to look, Mrs. Whitmore did not scold the boy but instead told Amara to focus on her work, as if she were the one causing the disruption, and that moment planted a quiet seed of confusion and hurt deep inside her heart. Still, she endured, because she had been taught to stay strong, because she believed things would get better, because she trusted that adults were meant to protect, not harm. But what no one realized was that beneath the calm surface of that classroom, tension was building like a storm waiting for the right moment to break, and the bond between teacher and student was slowly twisting into something darker, something that would one day explode in a way no one could ever forget. And as that storm continued to grow, one small incident would soon push everything past the point of return. The first real crack in the quiet balance of that classroom came on an ordinary morning that did not seem important at first. Because the sun still shone through the windows, the students still opened their books, and Mrs. Whitmore still stood at the front with her usual composed expression. Yet something in the air felt slightly off, like a warning that no one could quite explain. It began during a reading exercise when each student was asked to stand and read a passage aloud. And when it was Amara's turn, she rose carefully, holding her book with steady hands as she always did, her voice soft but clear as she began to read, choosing each word with care so she would not make a mistake. At first, everything went smoothly, but halfway through the paragraph, she paused briefly, not because she did not understand the word, but because she wanted to pronounce it correctly. And in that tiny moment of hesitation, Mrs. Whitmore's voice cut through the room sharply, telling her to continue without stopping, her tone louder than necessary and filled with an impatience that made several students glance up in surprise. Amara quickly corrected herself and finished reading, expecting to sit down quietly like everyone else, but Mrs. Whitmore did not move on to the next student. Instead, she stared at Amara for a few seconds too long before saying that confidence mattered more than perfection. Yet the way she said it did not feel like advice. It felt like a warning. The class shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something was not right, and one girl near the front lowered her eyes, pretending to focus on her notebook so she would not be noticed, while a boy at the back leaned slightly toward his friend and whispered that Mrs. Whitmore seemed angry again. From that day forward, the tension became harder to ignore. Mrs. Whitmore began calling on Amara more often than anyone else, sometimes asking difficult questions that were beyond the level of the lesson. And when Amara answered correctly, there was no praise, only a quiet nod as if it meant nothing. But when she struggled even slightly, the correction came quickly and sharply, making it clear to everyone that the expectations placed on her were different. At lunch, Amara sat alone more frequently, not because she wanted to, but because the others had started to notice the pattern. And children, even when they do not understand everything, can sense when someone has become a target, and sometimes they choose distance out of fear rather than cruelty. One afternoon, as the class worked on a group assignment, a boy accidentally knocked over Amara's materials, scattering her papers across the floor. And while she bent down to pick them up, Mrs. Whitmore spoke again, telling her to be more careful, even though everyone had seen what really happened. And that moment made something shift inside the room, because it was no longer just strictness. It was something else entirely. That evening when Amara returned home, her mother noticed the silence that followed her, the way she placed her bag down more slowly than usual, and the way her smile did not quite reach her eyes. And though Sergeant Johnson asked gently if everything was all right, Amara simply nodded, choosing not to worry her, choosing to carry the weight alone just a little longer. But silence, like pressure, can only be held for so long, and the next incident would not stay hidden, because someone else was about to see what had been happening all along. The person who finally began to notice that something was truly wrong was not a teacher or a parent, but a quiet boy named Daniel who sat 2 rows behind Amara and had spent most of the school year observing more than speaking, because he was the kind of student who paid attention to small details that others often ignored. Daniel had seen the way Mrs. Whitmore's tone changed whenever she spoke to Amara, how her voice became sharper, how her patience seemed thinner, and how even when Amara did everything correctly, there was always something else to criticize, and though he did not fully understand why, he knew it was not fair. One afternoon, during a math lesson, Daniel noticed something that made his stomach tighten, because as Mrs. Whitmore walked between the rows checking work, she stopped beside Amara's desk and leaned in closer than usual, her hand pressing down firmly on the edge of the desk as she pointed at a problem that was not even incorrect, her voice low but intense as she told Amara she needed to try harder, even though the answer was right. Amara nodded quietly, her fingers gripping her pencil a little tighter, and Daniel could see that she was trying to remain calm, trying not to draw attention to herself. But there was a slight tremble in her hands that had not been there before, and that tremble stayed with him long after the class ended. Later that day, while most of the students rushed out to catch the bus or meet their parents, Daniel lingered near the hallway outside the classroom, pretending to search through his bag as he waited, because he had noticed that Mrs. Whitmore had asked Amara to stay behind, saying she needed to discuss her progress. The hallway slowly emptied until it was nearly silent, and that was when Daniel heard voices coming from inside the classroom, not loud enough to make out every word, but clear enough to understand the tone, and the tone was not kind. He moved closer to the door, his heart beating faster as he realized that Mrs. Whitmore was speaking in a way that no teacher should speak to a student, her voice rising and falling in sharp waves as if she were arguing with someone much older, while Amara's voice remained soft and barely audible, trying to respond without making things worse. Then there was a sudden sound, like a chair scraping harshly against the floor, followed by a brief silence that felt heavier than anything Daniel had ever experienced. And in that silence, he felt something was deeply wrong, something he could not ignore. He wanted to open the door to step inside, but fear held him back, because he did not know what he would see or how he would explain why he was there. And so he stood frozen for a few seconds longer before finally hearing footsteps approach, forcing him to quickly step away and pretend he had just been passing by. When the door opened, Amara walked out first, her face pale and her eyes fixed on the ground, and behind her, Mrs. Whitmore followed with a calm expression that seemed too perfect, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Daniel watched as Amara left without saying a word, and in that moment he made a quiet decision that would later become very important. He would not ignore this, but he had no idea how dangerous the truth really was. And the next day, that danger would come closer than ever before. The next day began like any other, with the morning bell ringing and students slowly filling the classroom. But beneath the routine, there was a quiet tension that had started to grow, especially for Daniel, who could not forget what he had heard the day before and now found himself watching everything more closely than ever before. Amara walked in a few minutes before class started, her steps slower than usual as she took her seat without looking at anyone. And though she tried to appear normal, there was something different in the way she held herself, like someone carrying a secret weight that was becoming harder to hide, while Mrs. Whitmore stood at her desk organizing papers with a calmness that seemed almost too controlled. As the lesson began, the atmosphere felt tighter, like a string pulled too far, and every small interaction seemed more intense than it should have been, because when Mrs. Whitmore called on students, her voice remained steady with everyone else. Yet when she turned to Amara, there was a sharpness that made even the quietest child shift in their seat. Halfway through the class, something happened that no one expected. A simple mistake on the board turned into a moment that changed everything. Mrs. Whitmore had written a math problem incorrectly, and when Amara, in her careful and respectful way, raised her hand and softly pointed out the error, there was a pause that stretched longer than it should have, because instead of correcting it calmly, Mrs. Whitmore slowly turned toward her, her expression tightening in a way that made the entire room feel suddenly colder. For a brief second, it seemed like she might simply fix the mistake and move on, but instead, she asked Amara to come to the front and explain it, her voice steady but carrying an edge that made the request feel more like a challenge than a normal classroom task. Amara hesitated, then stood up and walked forward, her movements careful and controlled. And as she reached the board, she began to explain the correction in a soft voice, choosing her words with respect. But before she could finish, Mrs. Whitmore interrupted her, questioning her explanation in a way that felt less like teaching and more like testing her patience. The class watched in silence as the exchange grew more uncomfortable, because every answer Amara gave seemed to lead to another question, another correction, another moment that stretched the tension further, until it no longer felt like a lesson at all. Daniel could feel his heart pounding as he looked around, noticing that others were also beginning to sense that something was wrong. But no one spoke, no one moved, because fear had quietly taken hold of the room. Then, in a sudden and unexpected motion, Mrs. Whitmore stepped closer to Amara, her voice dropping lower as she said something that only the front row could hear. And whatever those words were, they made Amara's face change, her calm expression breaking for the first time as her eyes widened slightly. And that was the moment everything started to slip out of control. Because instead of backing down, Amara spoke again, her voice still respectful but carrying a firmness that had not been there before, as if she had finally reached the point where silence was no longer an option. The room held its breath. Mrs. Whitmore's expression shifted, and what happened next would set the stage for the moment no one could undo. Just before we get back to the story, I'm curious, where are you watching from today? And if you're enjoying this journey so far, make sure you're subscribed for more stories like this. For a brief moment after Amara spoke, the classroom felt suspended in time, as though every second had slowed down just enough for everyone to sense that something irreversible was about to happen. And Mrs. Whitmore stood there staring at her, with an intensity that no longer resembled that of a teacher correcting a student, but something far more personal and unsettling. Amara had not raised her voice. She had not shown disrespect, yet the quiet firmness in her words seemed to strike a nerve that had been building for weeks. And as the silence stretched, the other students began to shift uncomfortably, their eyes moving between the two as if watching a line being crossed that should never have been touched. Mrs. Whitmore took a slow step closer, her face tightening as she repeated Amara's words back to her in a tone that twisted them into something else entirely. And though her voice was not loud, it carried a sharpness that made it impossible to ignore, while Amara stood her ground, her hands at her sides, her breathing steady but deeper than before. Daniel felt his chest tighten as he leaned forward slightly in his seat, his instincts telling him that this was no longer just a tense moment, because there was something in Mrs. Whitmore's posture that looked different, something that reminded him of the way people acted when they were no longer thinking clearly. The rest of the class remained silent, not because they did not want to speak, but because they did not know how, as fear slowly replaced confusion and settled into the room like a heavy shadow that made it hard to move or even whisper. Then, in a sudden motion that felt too fast to fully process, Mrs. Whitmore reached out and grabbed Amara's arm, her grip firm enough to make several students gasp. And though it might have been meant to pull her aside or assert control, the force behind it made it clear that something had shifted beyond normal discipline. Amara tried to pull back, not aggressively but instinctively, her voice breaking slightly as she said something that could not be heard clearly from the back of the room, and that small resistance seemed to push Mrs. Whitmore further, her control slipping in a way that turned tension into something dangerous. The classroom erupted into murmurs as a few students half rose from their seats, unsure whether to run or call for help, but still frozen by the fear of making things worse. And Daniel felt his hands shake as he looked toward the door, realizing how far away it suddenly felt. Mrs. Whitmore's voice rose now, no longer controlled, no longer measured, as she accused Amara of being defiant, of challenging her authority. And though the words themselves might have sounded like something said in anger before, the way they were delivered made them feel heavier, sharper, and far more serious. Amara shook her head, trying to explain, trying to calm the situation, but her words were cut off again, and the moment spiraled further, the space between them shrinking until it felt suffocating, until the room itself seemed to close in around them. And then, in a movement that would replay in the minds of everyone who witnessed it, Mrs. Whitmore's hands moved again, not just holding, not just pulling, but rising toward a place they should never have gone. The class froze completely. Daniel stopped breathing, because in that instant, everyone realized that this was no longer a misunderstanding. Something terrible was about to happen, and no one knew how to stop it. The moment stretched into an eternity, each second heavier than the one before, because as Mrs. Whitmore's hands tightened around Amara's neck, the classroom transformed from a place of learning into a silent chamber of terror, where the usual sounds of pencils scratching on paper, chairs shifting, and faint whispers of the air conditioning had vanished, leaving only the unnatural rhythm of a young girl struggling to breathe, and a teacher losing herself in anger that had been building far too long. Amara's small body struggled instinctively, her fingers clawing at the front of Mrs. Whitmore's blouse, her knees bending as if to escape, but every movement seemed futile against the force that now held her firmly in place. And Daniel, sitting frozen in the back, could feel the panic spreading through his chest like fire, his mind screaming at him to do something, anything, yet his body refused to move. The other students began to whimper quietly, the sound of fear threading through the air like invisible cords that bound them to the moment, while a few pressed their hands to their mouths, unable to scream, unable to call for help, because the sheer shock had rooted them to the floor in a way that made every heartbeat thunder louder than their thoughts. Amara's eyes widened as she tried to meet Mrs. Whitmore's gaze, searching for a glimmer of reason, some recognition of the horror unfolding. But all she saw was a storm inside the teacher, a violent twisting of patience, frustration, and cruelty that no one had been able to predict. And in that instant, every student felt as if they were witnessing something too dark to understand, something that should never exist inside a classroom. Then the door opened. The sudden sound of it cracking against the wall echoed through the room, cutting sharply through the tense silence, and every head turned, including Mrs. Whitmore's, whose face froze mid-motion, her eyes locking onto the doorway where Sergeant Alicia Johnson now stood, her uniform perfectly pressed, her boots planted firmly, and her presence radiating a discipline and authority that no one in the room could ignore. Amara's small body sagged slightly as if relief had hit her all at once, but that relief was tempered immediately by the way her mother's expression shifted from shock to something darker, a mixture of disbelief, fury, and a protective storm that had been held back for too long. Mrs. Whitmore's hands trembled as she realized what had just happened and who was standing there, her mind scrambling for excuses, explanations, any words that could undo the fact that she had crossed a line that could never be forgiven. Sergeant Johnson took a single step into the room, her eyes locking on the teacher in a way that made the air feel heavier, the students holding their breath as they watched the power in that one gaze, a silent warning that consequences were about to unfold. And just when it seemed like Mrs. Whitmore might finally retreat, a sharp voice broke through the room, louder than any bell, colder than any winter morning, saying just 3 words that made everyone flinch. "You hurt her." Mrs. Whitmore's lips parted, and for the first time the control she had clung to for years shattered completely. And then the unthinkable was about to begin. Because what Sergeant Johnson would do next would change everything, not just for Mrs. Whitmore, but for every person in that classroom, and no one was ready to witness it. The room was still, but the air vibrated with the kind of tension that could snap at any second, because Sergeant Alicia Johnson did not move quickly. Yet every step she took toward Mrs. Whitmore carried a weight that made it feel like the walls themselves were pressing in on the terrified teacher. Her eyes never left the woman who had dared to harm her child, and the quiet authority in her posture told everyone in the room that this was no ordinary confrontation. It was a reckoning, and it would be felt in every heartbeat. Amara slumped into her chair, finally able to breathe, though her chest still heaved from the fear and panic of the last moments. She looked up at her mother, and in that gaze, 1,000 unspoken emotions passed between them: relief, love, fear, and a quiet acknowledgement that the bond they shared could survive the darkest of moments, but only because neither had given up, even when the world seemed ready to take everything from them. Mrs. Whitmore, on the other hand, seemed incapable of speech. Her hands, still shaking from the adrenaline of what she had just done, were frozen in front of her, and her mind raced for explanations that would somehow absolve her, but the words never came. There was no defense for what had occurred, no way to spin the truth that would make it acceptable, and deep down, she knew that every lie she had told herself to feel in control had failed spectacularly. The students watched silently, their faces pale, their breaths shallow, and even the ones who had been too afraid to act before felt the weight of justice building in the room, the kind of presence that demanded recognition, that made them understand instinctively that what had happened was wrong beyond words. Some of them hid their faces behind their hands, others glanced at their classmates with wide eyes, and all of them felt the undeniable pull of witnessing a line crossed and a reckoning arriving. Sergeant Johnson's voice finally broke the tension, low, controlled, but sharp enough to make everyone in the room flinch. "You hurt my daughter. You will answer for this," she said, and each word carried the authority of someone trained to lead, to protect, and to take action when justice demanded it. It was not a threat. It was a promise, and Mrs. Whitmore realized with growing horror that no amount of excuses or fear could undo it. Then, as if the moment could not grow more unbearable, Sergeant Johnson reached forward and gently placed a hand on Amara's shoulder, grounding her daughter in the safety of her presence. Amara felt a mix of relief and fear wash over her, knowing that while her mother's arrival had stopped the immediate danger, it had also triggered something in the teacher that no one could predict. Mrs. Whitmore's lips quivered, her voice finally finding air, but it was hollow, distant, and defeated. I didn't mean," she began, but the words fell short, swallowed by the intensity of the moment. And then the classroom door slammed shut behind them, echoing like a final warning, as if sealing the moment in time, leaving everyone trapped in the aftermath of what had happened, and forcing them to face the truth that nothing would ever be the same. Because even though Amara was safe, the story was far from over, and the consequences of what had just unfolded were only beginning to ripple through their lives. And in that silence, every student, every adult, and every witness could feel one undeniable truth: the next move would determine everything. And no one could predict how far it would go. After the classroom door slammed, a heavy quiet fell over the room, the kind of silence that presses down on your chest and makes every sound feel distant, because the students were still processing what had happened, and even the air seemed too tense to move freely. Amara sat frozen in her seat, her fingers gripping the edge of her desk as her mother's hand rested firmly on her shoulder, a reminder that she was no longer alone, that someone powerful and unyielding was standing right beside her, protecting her in a way that left no room for doubt. Mrs. Whitmore's face had drained of color, her eyes darting nervously around the room as if searching for a way out, some invisible escape that would let her pretend none of this had occurred. But the truth had already carved itself into the walls of that classroom, into the memories of every child who had witnessed the scene, and deep down, she knew there was no going back. Her years of authority, her carefully constructed image of control, all crumbled in the span of a single, irreversible moment. Sergeant Johnson took a slow step forward, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the fear lingering in the room. "You will explain yourself," she said, each word deliberate, leaving no ambiguity about the consequences of what had just happened. Amara's classmates watched, wide-eyed, as the teacher's mouth opened, closed, and then opened again, words forming, dissolving, and vanishing into the tension of the moment. It was the first time anyone had seen her powerless, and it was terrifying in a way that made the children understand, for the first time, that adults were not invincible, that actions had consequences. Amara felt the weight of her mother's gaze, steady and unwavering, and she realized something important. Fear had been a constant companion in the classroom for weeks, but courage had arrived the moment her mother walked in. She didn't speak. She didn't need to, because the presence beside her spoke louder than any words could, and the truth of the situation settled like a heavy stone into the hearts of everyone there. Then, unexpectedly, Mrs. Whitmore's expression shifted. The trembling in her hands increased, and her voice finally found a shaky edge. I didn't mean to," she started, but the words were meaningless against the magnitude of her actions. Sergeant Johnson's eyes narrowed, and the room seemed to shrink under the sheer force of her silence, until the words stopped entirely, leaving only the truth hanging like a blade over the terrified teacher. At that moment, Amara's gaze flicked to Daniel, who sat in the back of the room, his own fear mingling with a new resolve. He had witnessed the injustice, and he had seen how quickly things could spiral out of control. But now, under the watchful eyes of someone who would not tolerate harm, he realized that standing silently was no longer an option. This was a lesson far bigger than the classroom, far bigger than the mistakes or misjudgments of any teacher. It was about protection, justice, and the courage to act when no one else would. And then, the unexpected sound of the principal's footsteps echoed down the hall, slow, deliberate, and foreboding, signaling that the moment had escalated beyond a classroom confrontation. The door creaked open once again, and the final piece of the reckoning was about to unfold. Because by the time the principal stepped inside, no one in that room would ever see school the same way again. The principal's entrance changed everything, because the moment he stepped into the classroom, the tension that had gripped every student, every adult, seemed to reach a boiling point, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for the truth to finally break free. He was a tall man with a presence that demanded attention, his eyes scanning the room with an unspoken authority. Yet even he paused when he saw what had just transpired. Amara trembling in her seat, her mother standing protectively beside her, and Mrs. Whitmore frozen, pale and powerless in the center of the room. Sergeant Johnson did not lower her gaze, did not step back. She met the principal's eyes with the same unwavering strength that had guided her through the most dangerous moments of her military career, and her voice, calm yet unyielding, filled the space between them. "My daughter was harmed," she said, the weight of every word pressing down like a verdict before any trial. "This is not a mistake, this is abuse. It stops now." Principal swallowed, his jaw tightening as he processed the scene, realizing that the situation had escalated far beyond the normal scope of school discipline. He looked at Mrs. Whitmore, who finally found her voice, shaking, broken, and desperate. I didn't mean," she stammered, but the words fell flat, meaningless against the evidence of her actions, against the silence of 20 students who had witnessed everything, and against the unwavering presence of a mother who would not allow her child to be harmed. Amara finally spoke, her voice small but steady, carrying the weight of the fear and courage that had built inside her over weeks of being targeted. "Please, don't let her hurt anyone else," she said, her eyes locking with the principal's, her words piercing the tension in the room. The room seemed to exhale at her courage, the simple truth of her plea cutting through the fear that had held everyone frozen for far too long. The principal took a deep breath and nodded, the first step toward justice taking shape as he reached for the phone to call the authorities, knowing that what had happened could not be ignored, and that the accountability required would extend far beyond a mere reprimand. He looked at Mrs. Whitmore, whose composure had completely shattered, her hands shaking, her shoulders slumped, and the realization that her actions had consequences hit her like a wave she could not escape. Sergeant Johnson stepped closer to her daughter, her hand resting lightly on Amara's shoulder, offering both protection and reassurance. And in that moment, Amara realized that fear could no longer control her life. She had survived the storm, but the storm would now consume the one who had caused it. As the authorities were called, the students whispered among themselves, trying to process the events that had unfolded in front of them, understanding in that instant that the world could be cruel, but that courage, protection, and truth were more powerful than any fear. The room, once a place of terror, now held a quiet promise that justice would be served. And though the day had ended with tears, trembling, and fear, it also ended with hope. That sometimes when the unthinkable happens, the right person standing in the right place can turn a nightmare into the first step toward justice. Because in that classroom, on that unforgettable day, Amara's life, and the lives of those who witnessed it, would never be the same again. The truth had been revealed, the darkness exposed, and the lesson was clear. Courage, love, and protection are stronger than fear, and the consequences of injustice will always catch up, even when no one expects it. The story had ended, but the life lesson would stay with everyone forever. That brings us to the end of this story. I'd love to know where you were watching from today. And if this story meant something to you, don't forget to subscribe for more.